Hello, hello. Hi, everyone. Wonderful. Good morning or even noon. This is Katerina from Building Minds. Hi. It's 11 o'clock, I'd say. We're starting to our session about sustainability and digitalization in real estate. We're really amazed how many people are interested in our session, so happy to welcome you. Today, we're going to discuss a few very interesting topics, among others, why flattening the curve, something that we've heard quite a lot around these days, is a topic not only related to the current exponential crisis, but to a challenge this and the next generations will actually really have to manage. It's the climate crisis. And we're going to discuss why decarbonization and digitalization are inseparably linked and why data are the real asset in real estate, so to speak. And I'm more than happy to welcome and introduce to you two highly interesting people and drivers of digitalization in the industry. It's Roger Baumann, COO and Head of Product Development, Global Real Estate of the Zurich Insurance Company, and Jens Müller, COO and Speaker of the Board of BuildingMinds. Happy to have you here. Roger, could you briefly introduce yourself to the audience?
Thank you, Katerina, and thanks for everybody joining this webinar today. I'm really pleased about the interest of this webinar and look forward to our conversation. As you mentioned, I'm CEO of Global Real Estate as part of the investment arm of Zurich Insurance Group. Sustainability and responsible business actually is at the heart of our business. We help clients to make their life more resilient to risks and especially to climate change. We manage around 18 billion assets under management in real estate, and we're one of the first insurers to commit to the UN Global Compact 1.5 degree target. And I'm very happy to share my thoughts today together with you and Jens and the other people in the audience.
Thanks a lot. Very happy to have you. Jens, a few words from your side.
Yes, of course, and thanks for everyone. Thanks to everyone for joining today. Yes, I'm Jens. I'm CEO of BuildingMinds. Spent like the past 25 plus years in the IT industry. Worked for Cisco almost 17 years. Helped to bring up startups here in Berlin and to from start to exit. And now we're on the BuildingMinds journey together. I'm very glad to share our thoughts with you. Particularly happy that Roger could join us. Roger and I had the chance to discuss the topic for the past 12 months or so. So we learned a lot from him, and looking forward to spend an hour with you. Happy to learn, happy to receive your questions. Some of them have been asked upfront already, or very interesting topics. So hopefully we can cover a lot during the hour in front of us today.
Very cool. Thanks a lot. It was really also a pleasure to prepare this session with you. We already had some very interesting discussions, which we're hopefully having later this hour. So in the next roundabout, let's say 20 minutes, Roger and Jens are going to provide you with a short presentation with findings, insights, maybe one or the other provocative thesis, I'd say. However, this is not going to be a cooking recipe today. It's a platform for discussion to share opinions and strategies, and we hope for a lot of discussions in this very interesting round of participants here. The presentation is of course followed by a Q&A session. However, whenever you have a question, feel free to ask it through the chat or just raise your hands, just speak out. We're happy to discuss with you. If it's German or English, whatever you prefer, we're happy with all questions and with the discussions followed by them. A few more housekeeping notes before we start. Please note that this session is being recorded, and please make sure that you mute your microphones to avoid some background noises, except for, of course, you want to share something with us, then please feel free to do that and unmute your microphones and speak out. Yeah, as mentioned, ask your questions whenever you have them during the presentation or even after in the Q&A session. Happy to have you all here.
Okay, so then let's get started. Hopefully voice and video and everything comes through Good enough. During times when our workplaces looks like that, and we are all challenged by what we potentially would call the small crisis later during the session today. So we are asking ourselves, what can we learn? What can we learn, particularly in our industry? What can we learn from like the digital versus the physical challenge in real estate? And that's what we actually want to start with. So what does flattening the curve means for us? So what does flattening the curve means for the COVID-19 crisis we are unfortunately in right now? What can we learn for what we probably would consider the bigger crisis, and what can we particularly learn in order to solve data or mathematical problems even? That's our starting point, and we saw there are many parallels looking at the sudden exponential crisis we are in right now, and the more like long-term crisis when we look at the CO2 challenge, the climate challenge in front of us. And for all of us, it's always hard to get the exponential function. So what would we expect to happen, and what would potentially happen when we look at the exponential function, the exponential growth in terms of anticipation? And there's a very nice quote out there: the greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. So that's what we're learning again today, more or less, in terms of the immediate crisis, but that's also very important in order to anticipate what's in front of us. And there are obviously many cases, and also many use cases like underpinning and underlying the exponential function and the complexity of data we need to deal with. And what we can see right now, and there's only a summary of curves and graphs and explanations, and looking at different parts in the world in connection to the corona crisis. Our key challenge is we need to deal with multiple interdependent measures. So there's a lot of complexity and correlation when it comes to data. Only single data points doesn't necessarily help. And in all the cases where we are missing the uplink or missing the correlation in order to make sense of data points, we are challenged. And you're all following the news and the many discussions about Corona apps and how it would help and does it help. The key learning at the end of the day is always, can we make sense of data? And based on educated decisions and the learning process, can we make decision and fix stuff? And there's a nice analogy if you look at, so the like immediate crisis, we put our hand on the oven plate and it gets burned. So that's what we more or less experiencing with the Corona thing. When we look at decarbonization, it's more like the frog in the pot, and it's get heated up like in very small steps, and the frog isn't even aware that it gets cooked over time. And the analogy in terms of flattening the curve is a little bit, if you're not able to manage it, the system will overheat and collapse. And that's the discussion with Corona. That's also the discussion of climate change. And there's a very nice picture. Help me out, Roger. It was on Economist.
It was in the Economist, yeah.
Yeah, Times Magazine. So that's our preliminary round right now, and the more challenging round is in front of us, with obviously a more dangerous enemy, and that's like what we can potentially learn. And another interesting view is the lockdown shows us a little bit what's actually possible and gives us a glimpse in regards to a potential low carbon future. Of course, we pay a big price right now in terms of economic impact, et cetera, and all that. But it shows a little bit how should I say, art of the possible. With the next challenge, of course, we want to do stuff right. So it's not like being forced to lock down, rather than what can we do in order to flatten the curve in a very well managed fashion. Roger, any comments on that one?
No, I think Jens, you bring it to the point. We are all, are in a strange situation right now, and we don't know how the new normal will look like. But we all know is that we will succeed in this Corona crisis. But there's another crisis that is here to stay, and that's the climate crisis. And this is something we want to discuss today.
So, as you just said, long-term existential crisis. There are many reports out there, more or less focusing on the real estate part of it. A lot of discussions in regards to the ecological impact, many discussions in regards to the economical impact, and clustered in different industries. And of course, the real estate industry is heavily impacted in many ways, and we will come to that and that will be a repeating message during the discussion. Real estate makes 40% almost of the global carbon footprint right now, both operational and embodied. And when we look at flattening the curve and the challenges, but also the opportunities, obviously real estate can make a big impact, and that's what people are looking at right now. You would find it in different newspapers, also different industry focused newspapers. What is the immediate impact on real estate, and what could be the long-term impact in terms of learnings? Immediate impact, without any doubt, is what we experience right now. Physical processes are much more affected than digital processes. Roger and I had a discussion last week in terms of what cannot be continued in the times of Corona. So whenever people need to go on site and potentially fly around the world in order to survey buildings, it's a challenge. So whenever we are missing the uplink, so to speak, in a digital way, we are more challenged than in other areas. Nevertheless, we are also very much aware a building is a physical thing, first of all, and we always need the connection between digital and physical. In our discussion, we oftentimes call it we fuse, or we want to fuse digital and physical, because there's no doubt if we want to operate a building, sooner or later someone needs to go on site and use a screwdriver or fix stuff on physical level. Nevertheless, when we look at the carbon curve and the climate curve, like everyone becomes aware, there's an impact, there is an exponential function involved here as well. And we need to do something now in order to impact it. And that's not only a green thing, and we do it all for Creator. There's always economic impact at the same time, and of course an impact on people who would use the buildings, live there, work there, but also operate the buildings. So there's always a correlation of stuff, and we want to go a little bit deeper, also using some more analogies in regards of what we are learning with Corona right now. A lot of discussions, what could we do with a patient record and infected people, etc., etc. And it's all great if we can do it for one single individual, but at the end of the day, in order to impact the whole thing, the whole crisis, we obviously also need to correlate patients' data. And that's another analogy with buildings and portfolios we are looking at right now. It only helps so and so much if we fix a single building. And we have many examples out there with smart buildings, particularly buildings that have been built during the past 3 to 5 years or so. We can plan it based on digital tools. We can put a BIM file on record. We can use latest technologies, etc., etc. We can all do all that. but it only helps so much if it's not correlated to the entire portfolio and if it's not correlated and benchmarked against the whole thing out there. Because as I said earlier, we have 39% energy related carbon emission based on buildings. And you can see what it means compared to other areas, and how it like splits in between the different phases of building a building and or constructing a building and operating a building. And there's also a learning we have looking at the data. The buildings represent a big part of the global carbon footprint right now, maybe the biggest, but there's also a very big savings potential using new technologies, using new benchmarks, getting the data points, etc. pp. So the impact, the theoretical impact is big, but also what we can do practically in order to influence that probably makes or could make a big difference. And right now, when we look at the buildings out there, there are probably less than 1% that we can consider to be carbon neutral right now. Again, new buildings are relatively easy, but our biggest challenge obviously is what I call the installed base. So the big chunk of buildings and portfolios out there. And correct me, Roger, you mentioned that last year when we met, and you said probably 80% of the portfolio we will operate by 2050 is built already, so it exists already, so we cannot fix it with
exactly.
And that makes a big part of the challenge. So it's not. And of course, we're all getting very much excited when we look at new buildings. We have many of them, many good examples in Berlin around us here. So that's all extremely exciting. And of course, we want to leverage technology as much as possible. But the overall challenge cannot be fixed with new construction. And that's one statement. Roger, maybe you can comment a little bit also how Zurich translates it into like your vision statements and plan to decarbonization. But 2015 seems to be a magic milestone in terms of more deadline than a milestone. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah.
With your view.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure, Jens. Yeah, we all know if we don't become net zero by 2050 and reach the Paris Agreement target of below 2 degrees, and there will be irreversible effects in the atmosphere that will cause dramatic shifts in weather and climate patterns. And what I experienced in the past, being now around 20 years around real estate and sustainability, is there's almost nobody really faces what it really means. And with this statement, we all should be aware of the fact that buildings that we plan right now and new buildings that have to be in place by 2030, they have to be net zero carbon already. Not talking about all the existing building stocks, and that's actually where we see the biggest potential and the biggest needs. They have to be 100% net zero by 2050. And this is actually the biggest challenge we are facing. In the past, most of the real estate investment managers talked about you just optimizing the buildings. We looked at operational carbon, but more and more, with more and more regulation kicking in and more realizing how to make our real estate investment portfolios more resilient against climate crisis. We also have to look at the entire life cycle of a building, not only thinking about operational carbon that our buildings emit that we can optimize, but also thinking about what is embodied carbon in new buildings and especially in existing buildings that we have to retrofit. I think this is a very strong message. And we see in the real estate industry and also in the industry overall that a lot of big companies commit to this net zero carbon target because it's an urgent call right now. And I think you come to that in one of your next slides. Yes.
Yeah, and maybe that's something for discussion later. You just mentioned it. How do we get data in the first calculation of embodied carbon when we look at a portfolio that might like have an age factor between, you correct me if I'm wrong, like 100 years, 150 years to like 10 years old or 5 years old or newly constructed. So that's probably a part of the challenge to get that benchmark in place. What would we look at in terms of embodied carbon footprint of a portfolio? And that's probably also one I would leave to you, O'Shea, to throw some lights on the embodied risk, if you will, when we look at the crisis and portfolio values, etc.
Yeah, thank you, Jens. I mean, we look at this from two perspectives in terms of risks. You know, on the one side, we are facing physical risks because of flooding, severe weather changes we had in the past that you can actually model right now. And here you see the correlation of we analyzed REITs, the enterprise value, and on the other axis you see the average climate risk score, and you can really see that there's a correlation between a lower climate risk exposure and a higher score in value of REITs. And the other thing that we are looking at is also, the transition risk that not only companies are facing, but real estate is facing because of tougher regulation. We think about, because of tougher regulation, what buildings are being stranded in the future. So these are the two dimensions that are nowadays looking at real estate investors are new aspects that are driven by huge amounts of data, scenario analysis, and much more in-depth data driven than it was in the past.
Also discussion we had for at least for the past 6 months or so, when we saw the investment streams are changing. So we saw a big announcement. I think the first one I became aware of last year around the Davos meeting was BlackRock stating we will only in the future only invest into sustainable products and also sustainable portfolios, and others followed. Even the big tech giants followed. We will come to that later because our partnership with Microsoft is very much affected by that in a very positive way. So we see a change of investments, and from my perspective, and we can discuss that a little bit, it overlaps a little bit the very long-term product cycle of a building, so like 30 years, 50 years, etc. And we all could argue, yeah, it's all about location and the good old KPIs looking at buildings. But now it gets overlapped when it comes to green and sustainability by investment targets of the big investors. So the long-term building product cycle is overlapped by the pretty much shorter term or short-term product cycle of the investors, right? So that changes a little bit how we calculate price tags, etc., etc. What O'Shea is much more into that. Maybe you can comment on that a little bit, O'Shea.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is probably a topic we can address with the next slide. You probably all are aware of studies also from the past that green buildings are not only more energy efficient but can also save money in the operating phase, and that we see higher values in green buildings. So I wanted to challenge this a little bit because, I mean, being in the real estate market for a long time, in the last 20 years, we've only seen one way that real estate valuations went, and this was up and up. And now we have this immediate shock of Corona that will drive some values down. And it is still not, visible in the market, or too visible in the market, that we see higher values for green building, because it's very much investment driven in the low interest environment, and this is here to stay. So I really see the challenge going forward, that we see more demand for green buildings or carbon neutral buildings, that they will more absorbed in the market that we see today. I think especially in changing markets, there's also an opportunity now to really, stress the urgency to make our real estate portfolio more resilient. There we see more the risk factors kicking in, and on the other side we will also see, maybe cost cuts, maybe tenants, not bringing revenues anymore in buildings. So the cost factor will be more important in buildings, and also the well-being factor in buildings. So we will probably see, and we have to see, if we have to follow the net zero carbon path, more demand for green and more resilient buildings.
Yeah.
Maybe this is also, Ed, you can add to that.
Yeah, well, we of course we're having many discussions. Would that be, and since we are discussing sustainability and digitalization at the same time, would the one be a driver for the other? So, like in terms of sense of urgency, etc. And we all know real estate in regards to digital is not necessarily a fast-moving industry. Let's put it this way. So we saw reports in the past where, I don't know, I think McKinsey did it a couple of years ago, like comparing the different industries in terms of digital readiness. And as far as I remember, real estate came through second but last before fishing and hunting. So something like slow. And our question is in regards to sustainability, also driving the value of portfolios. Would that change the mindset a little bit? And if there is one positive side looking at the Corona crisis, I don't think there are many positive things to say about Corona, but one is, and that's what we are experiencing right now, is like sharpened mindset in terms of digital. So because the physical stuff is broken, and like 6 months ago, I still had like this discussions on panels in Munich at Expo Real that people said, hey, let's just skip digital when it comes to real estate. Our life is pretty much okay right now. We see all the hassles when we compare with other industries like automotive, etc., etc. Let's just skip that part. But now we see a really sharpened mindset about the meaning of digital when it comes to real estate.
Maybe a question for Roger. Is it the case that the Corona crisis changes, or let's say influences the change of priorities over sustainability, so to speak, because it's a new risk class in a sense? I'm sure that it plays a role. So how do you handle the sustainability topic with regards to the learnings, maybe even that we take from the Corona crisis at the moment?
That's a very good question. I mean, at the very moment, Katharina, we deal with a lot of tenants, because the impact on the economy is huge, and we don't see at the moment, where this really leads us. So it's difficult to also make a projection about, how much will this impact property values. What we see that in some segments there might be probably less demand. I mean, it's obvious that we are all sitting now in our home offices. So the question is, how will this affect the demand for office space, for example, in central AAA locations, or will we see just like kind of offices in suburban areas and we stay at home for 2 to 3 days? What's the impact on cars, for example, if we in a family mother and father work, do we really need 2 cars if we can work 2-3 days at home? So it's still not clear how this will change overall. So that's what we are dealing with. Nevertheless, we do not stop. I mean, projects like digitalization or thinking about sustainability or making our real estate portfolio more resilient. We use the time right now to get more accurate data, to really have a better understanding on how can we measure risk and put a value on risk for each and every property. And within Zurich, we also committed to the Science-Based Target Initiative. So we are working very hard to develop also pathways and commit to pathways how to decarbonize the portfolio. We also see in the market, there are transactions that are stalled or that are slower, but we see that transactions that are ongoing, they will be concluded. And it's even more the question, you know, how resilient is a building and what are the sustainability KPI of a building. And once again, for me, it all comes down to information and data quality of a building. How you implement, for example, a carbon due diligence in a building when you want to buy a building. And I would say the topic of sustainability in a short term, you know, just after the shock we had mid-March, it was probably, you know, second priority. But now people see probably a little bit more where we come out with this crisis. So the topic is more important than ever.
Yeah.
Short question, long answer.
And during the preparation a couple of minutes ago, we also discussed the CO2 charges and what it means for the calculation of the journey and maybe also the portfolio value. Maybe 2 or 3 sentences on that one, Roger?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a question, you know, is there or will there be a price on carbon? We know there will be one. And actually, we also, you know, think as Zurich that there has to be a price on carbon. So the question is how high has this to be to steer investment flows into more, you know, sustainable investments. So this is something we are also modeling right now into our portfolio management system, implement scenarios on different carbon prices and how it will affect the value of buildings.
Mm-hmm. And there were questions up front, and maybe we'll come to that a little bit later when we look at like also how we merge in terms of data points, etc. The financial view and the technology view. So what's coming in our direction in regards to technology, and how can we leverage it, and how can we connect like the physical driven data points in the building to the business logic on a higher level in order to do all those projections necessary. So we will come to that in a couple of minutes. Maybe one final view also on like the stranded assets view and how it compares in different regions of the world. And that's something I would like to ask you to cover as well, Roger.
Yeah, I think we touched on the physical risks already earlier on, and what we've seen in the last decade was damages of around 2.7 trillion because of natural disasters. And if we don't reach these plateau, or if you can't, you know, flatten the curve, and that was a good example, you know, linking a corona curve and carbon curve. We will see probably much more damage, much more comprehensive cost. That projections are leading up to $30 trillion in the next 10 years. So this is something where we as an insurer clearly go beyond the analysis of our portfolio, not just, collecting data about energy efficiency or how we calculate carbon scope 1 or scope 2 emissions. It's about connecting different data points in a way to get a clearer pictures on where we stand in terms of the resilience of our entire real estate portfolio.
Okay, and now let's talk a little bit more about technology and what we need in order to steer that journey. And that's something we discussed a couple of months ago when we said Excel, and nothing against the nice Microsoft product, but Excel's obviously not an option to do that calculation and that multi-dimensional chess game we need to solve. So there's a good quote of Albert Einstein: the significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. So and that leads us a little bit more into the technology discussion and what's needed in order to, first of all, capture the data and do the predictions and everything we need in order to calculate that journey and the milestones, etc. So we need obviously transparency first, because otherwise we don't know where the problem is. Having in mind it's not about a single building only. At the end of the day, of course, it's about a single building, but first of all, it's about benchmarks and impacts we can make, also with the resources available, because at the end of the day, again, coming back to my earlier statement, somebody needs to go on site and fix something in order to change the important milestones, address the important milestones of the journey. And when compared to other industries, there's also an eye-opening view on that always. So there are a lot of discussions about the impacts of cars and transportation, etc. And of course, in terms of production, chemical industry, etc. When we look at the carbon impact and the carbon footprint, and the eye-opening thing to me is always we have 58% of potential positive impact when we do the right things on buildings. And compared to the earlier statement, buildings make 40% of the global carbon footprint. That's obviously a lot, also to compare to other industries. And one of our key challenges is obviously how we get the data points. So how we get what I would call the static data points, and that what we obviously can get from existing financial systems, ERP, and portfolio management, etc. But what do we do also with the dynamic data points that would come from operating a building on the daily level, right? So obviously with tenants, with energy consumptions, with behaviors using a building, etc. And what impact can we make with available resources? At the end of the day, we need to pay for it. So it needs to be a business model behind it in order to allocate resources. And for us, we look at it as a multi-level chess game, if you will, because we have so many changing data points. So we cannot take it for granted that we do a benchmark tomorrow. Even that's hard already. And then we can deal with the same data points on a 30 years journey. So there's an almost daily change of data points. And that's probably our biggest challenge right now. And we said today we don't want to talk too much about products and too much about technology, but of course there is an immediate impact in order to do that benchmarking on a portfolio level, in order to identify the black shapes or even the green shapes. So what is the negative benchmark within portfolio? What's the positive benchmark? And from our perspective, how we can go broad benchmarking entire portfolio and deep at the same time. So identify the outliers and do something with available resources. And that's obviously money, time, people, etc., because we need to transform portfolios. And that was a discussion Roger and I had also a couple of months ago when I said, hey, couldn't we just fix it with selling hot potatoes? But that's obviously not the name of the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe I can jump in here, Jens. You showed the slide. Excel is not an option. You know, being probably most of our colleagues being in the webinar, and we open up the discussion hopefully in a few minutes, agree that the real estate industry is still, you know, lagging behind with property manager data getting into a system, or energy data getting into a system. And now we are much further down the road. You know, we know where we have to be in 2050, but we all don't have the strategy and the underlying data and the data models to really, you know, also monitor this and put kind of a carbon accounting system over these all these requirements that we have to fulfill coming from the regulatory side. And I think therefore the call for digitalization, more data transparency and system that can integrate data into probably existing portfolio management system is more urgent than ever. Sorry, I'm getting back to you, Jens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And then, of course, there's a lot of discussion about AI and how algorithms could help us to do that correlation and projection. But the best AI model doesn't help if we have low quality data. So how do we get the data points is extremely important before we can even apply algorithms. And of course, there are big mathematical discussions around it. So how can we apply existing algorithms or already known algorithms in order to do the projection and apply the right models that could help us ultimately? Maybe 2 or 3 comments from your side, Roger, on that one as well.
Yeah, I think there are always two ways to get the carbon footprint or the risk exposure of a building. You can either, you know, measure energy consumption and calculate your carbon emissions, or where you don't have the data or you don't have it in a system. And this is especially the problems if you have large portfolios, talking about hundreds of buildings. You need to kind of estimate your carbon footprint and then model your decarbonization pathway. And right now in the market, looking at it, there's not one single system that can really, you know, fulfill all the requirements. We are talking here in the first step about, you know, decarbonization pathways. That's kind of a two-dimensional thing, but we also talk about, you know, the digital twin when we talk about what's the embodied carbon in a new building. So there are probably new dimensions coming up where dealing with measured and estimated data points is getting more and more important. That's why we need more sophisticated systems that follow strict methodologies that are not implemented in the market yet.
Yeah, and that's a little bit a handover to what we are doing right now, also what we are doing together with our technology partners. And that's just a screenshot that should illustrate a little bit. I mentioned it earlier, we have a technology partnership with Microsoft, strategic partnership with Microsoft in place, where we particularly also look at carbon footprint calculations. And interesting discussion we're having right now, and that's an example how the model looks like for supply chain. Interestingly enough, you see a lot of parallels when you look at the left-hand corner of the slide here. So what would be the scientific models for particular clusters on their journey? Energy, materials, financial, water, waste, that also plays a role. I had recently a discussion with folks in Middle East during a similar webinar, and they said, well, energy is still very cheap where we live for good or bad reasons. Our biggest problem is water, like as in resource to be managed on those scientific models as well. But very important for us when we start to develop our platform and also our initiatives, what is the data model and the engine room in order to make that journey even possible? Because we just said it only works based on data, it only works based on high quality data, it only works if data can be correlated and algorithms can be applied. What is also the link in regards to static and dynamic data, right? There were questions up front asking how we would link the, I would say, the IoT work stream within the building to the business logic on top of that. And what we are doing is we created a strategic initiative together with Microsoft, also leveraging common data models that have been developed for other industries in the past. So in this particular case for manufacturing, and with our data initiative, together with our strategic partners, we said we want to build a similar data model for real estate in order to capture all the important data points and work streams and correlate them. And together with Microsoft, RIX, and PAM Plus, our strategic partners here, we created an initiative called IBPDI. I'm myself still struggling with the wording in order to create data model for real estate to be able to capture all the relevant data we need to deal with. So it's probably, first of all, a little bit unsexy fixing of the engine room, but we are very excited about it also to drive it together with our strategic partners to build that industry model for real estate, because we also experience that we might have a whole bunch of use cases, so to speak, or challenges where the data and the data model would actually overlap. So if we, when we are able to get all the relevant data for sustainability and CO2 emissions, we probably could solve at the same time other use cases and vice versa. So we look at portfolio value, we just discussed it pretty much in detail. We look at people well-being, tenant satisfaction, transparency in regards to develop maybe new business models, or Jay just mentioned it a little bit earlier, what would change because of Corona, right? We have all those discussions. There were original plans that within the next 5 to 7 years, the construction industry would add like 25% more office space globally. So that's probably plans all the big investors would look at right now in terms of, do we need that office space? If not, what would be the business models looking at the existing space? So how would co-working business models develop, et cetera, et cetera. So that's all only possible if we can correlate the data, and we believe we can do that based on our model. And last but not least, no doubt about it, operations efficiency is still the name of the game. So every serious investor would look at what can we do based on existing real estate, existing floor plans, existing space, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no doubt space is the currency of real estate, and that will not significantly change. Nevertheless, we believe it makes sense to develop a building of the future standard, and we started that initiative a couple of weeks ago. So feel free to go to the website and make yourself familiar. It's an open model. It's an open source model where we would invite partners to work with us. And last but not least, because before we open up for questions, in order to drive the discussion home a little bit, and I oftentimes call it our mantra looking at the industry. So it's about people, it's about the planet, and it's about profits, our Trinity model, so to speak. And we need to address all three areas at the same time in order to make it work. So if one of the areas falls significantly short, we're gonna have a challenge with the other two or with all three at the end of the day. That was it from our side. Katharina, I would like to hand over back to you, and we are more than happy to answer questions like now and also further down the road. But Katharina, back to you. Maybe we have questions to answer that have been asked up front or in the chat or both.
Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot. It was really, really interesting, and myself also enjoyed the discussion very much. There is indeed a few questions. However, before we ask them, is there someone in the audience who has a question? Please frankly speak out, whatever you have. We're happy to discuss with you. Other than that, I would continue with a question that we've received up front. It's connected to the IoT topic. Connecting physics with the digital is apparently something that is highly important. However, can we consider IoT being the new messiah in the industry, or how do we have to, assess IoT in that context?
Roger, do we want to go first?
Yeah, maybe I can try to give an answer to this. IoT is around for quite a while, and actually having more data points is actually the way forward for sure. Looking at a single building, this is probably becoming more and more important, but looking at a portfolio, and as I mentioned, if you have billions of assets, billions real estate value, or hundreds of buildings that you manage, you probably need to have to look at it from strategic point of view. So which are really the data points you really need to actually decarbonize your portfolio, which is the main endeavor we focus to the next 30 years. So yes, we will see much more connected things. It will be much more important, but we also need to make sure that this is done in a systematic way when we gather data and interpret the data.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot. There is a question from that.
Jens, probably the technological point of view, so that would be interesting.
I will comment on that, and that gives me the chance to bring up a picture and a slide we actually took to the backup, but then we saw the questions, and that helps us a little bit to also illustrate how we see it, and maybe a quick look at the past, or my personal past, because my last journey was a Relayer company that was only focused on IoT, so to speak. Mm-hmm. We had a long discussion always, how would IoT be connected to a business logic? So it doesn't help if the uplink and the logical uplink in this particular case isn't there, and it doesn't resonate in a business logic. And that's what we are trying to fix with our model right now, to look at all three dimensions. So we discussed the stakeholder view or the portfolio management view a lot during the discussion today, which is very important from a investor business case perspective. There's the right dimension of our picture here. Also, what does it mean in order to operate a building? Also, from investor down to a tenant. And the horizontal layer is how to connect the subsystems within a building. And based on our model, also on our data model on digital twin, we are addressing all three dimensions right now, because we always said we need to go broad in order to do a benchmark on portfolio level, but also need to be able to go deep in order to leverage existing data points and connect to existing systems. And we, when we look at current projects right now, we love to do it on API or cloud-to-cloud level, because it just scales better. But we are also able to connect to a particular building on, on existing DMS systems or existing IoT use cases. And again, that dynamic part of it, could we go to the outliers, positive or negative, benchmark them, and leverage all technology possibilities we have available or coming in our direction?
That's very, very good point. I guess you've somehow covered even the question from Hendrik asking how to convince investor to invest in sensors, which you explained with the business logic that needs to be there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, exactly. And we have that discussion, Katharina, I know you every single day with like real projects right now. Does it make business sense or not? So of course it adds a lot of transparency, no single doubt. But the key question on investor level would always be, okay, can I scale? So can I do it on, I don't know, 150 buildings in order to lift the data quality on the entire portfolio? Or is it only a one-time off? So nothing against technologies, because that's also a discussion we're having with Microsoft a lot right now. So we spent 1 week virtually in Redmond last week discussing exactly that. So what would be the challenge of the last mile, so to speak, to get the transparency we need and then fix the problem? So that's always that fuzzy logic, right? So get the entire portfolio, digging deep, fix the problem. And of course, we need to fix the problem, and IoT could help us a lot. But it's always like a benchmark of use cases.
Yeah. And of data quality in the end. So that's how it relates to another question from Lucas. He asks, what is the future validation process to guarantee the quality of data, value or cost? Furthermore, what is the perception of investors in the commodity real estate market about data collection?
Oh, that's a very good, and Roger, you need to answer that as well. Again, our discussion right now, could we implement a quality guardian? So does data make sense compared to the model? And that's a very important question right now, by the way, also for AI. So would we have like an entry gate for data, and we only let data pass if data makes sense and we have a high quality standard? Not yet fixed, I guess, but heavily working on it.
Yeah, I mean, this is becoming more and more important, you know, the data audit in terms of sustainability and benchmark data that you publish in an annual report of a fund, for example, and at the moment, I mean, as we don't have a, you know, synchronized methodology, as I mentioned before, in for example, carbon accounting, or how we you know report our sustainability KPIs, there will always be kind of an external auditor who has to make sure that what we report, like in financial reporting, that what we report is accurate and in line with policies. But I see that it is becoming more and more important, and it's already, you know, for some auditors, it's already part of the mandate, you know, to audit data. And we also, you know, as a real estate investor, we say we don't have the in-depth knowledge to judge whether an energy KPI is correct or a carbon KPI. There we need external partners and systems that are reliable, that calculate these KPIs according to certain algorithms correctly. And that's where we see the potential, and that's why we put Excel is not an option in there. So there I see a clear demand in the future, which, and I think this was also part of the questions, which will be associated with cost, for sure.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Roger, you mentioned standards. I think even in the field of sustainability, it's around 50 different international or national standards out there. How do you manage that strategically in terms of your huge portfolio? How do you integrate that? What role do data standards play?
Yeah, Katharina, I mean, that's the key question for a lot of real estate investors. And I mean, we really look at, you know, what are the most common models in the industry. We look at applying greenhouse gas protocol scheme, for example, and we also look at, you know, other big parties, how do they deal with this data and standardization problem. And last but not least, I'm also a member of RICS, and I think we should follow recommendations from big, like say, industry bodies also on this topic. And there is also a huge push on that to standardize that. Also, if you look at initiatives like the TCFD in Europe, there's a big demand on standardization and having clarity on what and how to report.
Many thanks. Very interesting.
Yeah, Katharina, if I may, there was a BIM question from Vincent I'd like to pick up, because thank you for the question. And of course, the standard and data model is very important to us. And if you want to go to the data initiative website, you will see that because we are discussing right now how can we take the BIM model, if you will, as a data standard and the data model to the entire life cycle of the business. So in the past, of course, with modern buildings, constructions, or the planning is done based on BIM, the construction is done based on BIM. We want to leverage material models, by the way. So that's a very important component of our data initiative. You will find that there.
Very cool. Thanks a lot. Is there any more questions out there? It's been a very, very short and interesting hour. It was, time passes so fast. In case there are more questions, and I know people do have a lot of meetings, please don't hesitate to ask them through our website, buildingminds.com, or send us an email, send us a message on our social channels. We'd be happy to discuss and answer them with you. Also, we'll send you a link of the webinar so that you can have a second look, so to speak, if you want to check on the sheep or any other chart. Happy to do that. And of course, also please join us for the next session. It's going to happen most likely beginning of June. And we're going to talk about how a platform and digital building twin become a key to transform data into actionable insights. So actually the next logical step, so to speak. All that's left is saying thanks a lot, especially to you, Roger and Jens. It was a great session.
Thank you. Yeah,
sure.
Looking forward to continuing the discussion with you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.